Well, my name is Brianna or Bree. We've met at one of the Democrat meetings, but I know you meet a lot of people.
No.
So thank you for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm having a good time on the trail and excited for the opportunity to be able to speak with you and your audience and everything. So appreciate it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, tell us who you are. Tell us your background, why you're running, and what you're running for.
Yep, my name is George Hernado. I'm running for Congress in the Democratic primary here in Indianapolis. I'm from Indianapolis. Grew up here. Went to Cornell for undergrad, Harvard for my master's in education policy. Joked that I was a perennial Obama world intern during that time. Everything from the White House to re-elect campaign headquarters, presidential inaugural committee, Department of Education, and other things kind of in the Democratic, political and policy space. Was fortunate enough after that to land a political appointment at the Department of Justice, doing press for the Civil Rights Division under Attorney General Holder, mere weeks before Ferguson, before Eric Garner in New York, promoted under Attorney General Lynch. Knew that I was going to go to law school at George Washington University, but an opportunity on Clinton campaign headquarters came up, doing delegate operations. So did that through the convention, came back, started, law school, and quickly got pulled into the Clinton Kane pre-elect transition team. And after that didn't go as I would have hoped, ended up helping run a successful DNC vice chair race. Then ran the policy shop for a national voting rights organization called Let America Vote that has since merged with End Citizens United. And as I was wrapping up law school, I'd been talking to a couple of presidential campaigns. This was 2019. Sorry, bad lighting in here. And I've known Mayor Pete since 2012, and so when the Q1 fundraising numbers came up and showed he was a real enough candidate, wasn't going to drop out in a month or anything financially, I texted him and I said, "I graduate soon. Put me to work." Heard from him immediately, and next thing I know, started as his national delegate director a day after graduation, and eventually, deputy political director for delegates in marathon states, and had a wide-ranging portfolio as the campaign's liaison to state legislators across the country, DNC members, superdelegates, etc. After that, finally took the bar exam, studied for that for Indiana, and worked for the Obama Foundation. I led their mayoral outreach and engagement on their reimagining policing pledge in the wake of George Floyd's death. So got over 300 cities across the country to, commit to reviewing their use of force policies. Then did voter protection for the Biden campaign in the general, moved back to DC in conversations to join the administration, but an unexpected opportunity came up to join the DC office of a law firm headquartered here in Indy. And, there I represented the African American Mayors Association, represented a number of cities across the country, a couple of national nonprofits, helping get federal funds, for the most part, for a variety of projects. And about 2 years ago, left and on my own shingle and had some clients, follow me, and built more on the outside, and wanted to also just have the flexibility of pursuing other passions that didn't fit within the economic, model of a law firm and a billable hour. And one thing led to another. I got encouragement to look at this seed, and now we're flying the plane, and so having a great time with it.
Yeah, that's quite a history.
It's been
On
busy.
top
It's been fun.
and
I've been very
studying for the
fortunate.
bar. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I said it's been a lot of fun. Definitely busy. Have learned a lot, and that's just on the professional side. Throughout all that time, have been active with the Democratic Party here in Indiana. Since I was a junior in college in 2012. I've been appointed as a page to the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, and that was after a unforgettable summer on the re-elect campaign, headquarters in Chicago for Obama. And that's where I came to learn about the Indiana Latino Democratic Caucus. So I was first a member, then president for 4 years, and helped build a statewide presence. And past 5 years up until last week, I represented the caucus on the governing board of the state party here. So that's been a lot of my party involvement side locally, and then I've done work with non-party, but just kind of activist organizations and things like that within the community as well.
Very cool. Okay. And I know that you're a little controversial, so I am proceeding a little lightly here because I know that you've talked about the congressman not being as efficient as you would like him to be. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is no shade. This is no disrespect to the congressman. I respect him personally. Up until this, I had a good relationship with him. I'm running basically for three reasons. To get shit done, to rebuild the party, and to fix what's broken. So on bucket number one, you know, don't take my word for it. Take the Center for Effective Lawmaking's, objective, neutrally, applied, to every member of Congress. He is in the bottom 7% of all members of Congress in effectiveness, and that's based off a legislative leadership and success standpoint. And that's not just from last congressional calendar, but it's consistent across essentially every congressional, term that he's been in. And so we can do better on that. And, I know some of the responses like, oh, well, that's on the legislative leadership side, because in 17 years, the only two things where he has been lead sponsor that have been signed into law is renaming a federal building and naming a memorial. But if you want to look at the grant side of things, we are lagging behind, peer cities in the urban Midwest and how much federal funds that we're bringing home. And so it's just something that we can't afford. Bucket number two, I talk about rebuilding the party, but I actually think about it in a broader way of fundamentally rethinking the role. But to start with the rebuilding the party piece, look, we've got a Republican governor that's already eyeing his next move. We've got a lieutenant governor that is defending the three-fifths compromise. We've got an attorney general and a secretary of state that are constantly under investigation. We've got GOP supermajorities in both the state house and the state senate. Things are bleak, right? But if the apparent problem is one-party Republican rule, then the underlying problem is a lack of democratic leadership, and we have to hold the mayor up to ourselves as Democrats. I don't care who the state party chair is. The Indiana Democratic Party is not the vehicle to bring us back because the brand is so weak. Then you look at state house and state senate leadership, and cycle after cycle, they've not materially grown their caucuses. Then you look at Congressman Frank Mrvan, and he doesn't have the luxury to think about party building because he's in a constant fight for survival in that national, important, and competitive seat. Then you look at some of the bright spots that we have in mayors outside of Indianapolis, but none have all three of the interests, the ability, and the experience to take on that party building leadership role. So what that means, conceptually, regardless of who's in there, is whoever is the mayor of Indianapolis and the congressperson out of Indianapolis, it's imperative that they not only have a baseline vision for the community and the work ethic to execute upon it, of which I'd argue neither Mayor Hogsett nor Congressman Carson have, but that they also take on that party building leadership role. Because back when Democrats in Indiana were competing and winning statewide, it's in large part because Indianapolis was organized. We were the best congressional district in the state in voter turnout. Precinct chair and vice chair slots, which is the baseline of neighborhood organizing, those were filled. The county party even had a larger budget than the state Democratic Party. But, in the past 17 years, the political infrastructure has hollowed out. We are now the worst congressional district in the state in voter turnout. We have 36% of our precinct chair and vice chair slots that are unfilled. Most that are filled are appointed to party insiders that are disconnected from the grassroots. And the county parties are essentially defunct. And so we are gerrymandered to hell. We are not getting any more congressional seats anytime soon. We are not getting majorities in the General Assembly anytime soon. But hopefully, this cycle or next, we can break the Republican supermajority in the state house. But it is not out of the question for us to be able to compete statewide again. I look at places like Kansas and Kentucky. These aren't Democratic states, but they've got Democratic governors, and albeit it's a little bit different with the Bashir name and legacy in Kentucky. But metro areas in these states during a presidential cycle, their voter turnouts in the mid to high 60s. Here in Indianapolis, it's in the low to mid 50s. So that is not a gap that is insurmountable. But just because we're safe, with Democratic representation here in Indy, that's not sufficient, because if we're not doing our part in pulling our weight, then we're not just hurting ourselves as Indy Democrats, but we're a drag on Democrats across the whole state. So that's the party building side. Then there's the party leadership side within this second bucket, where, look, we've got, the governor talking about a $2.5 billion surplus. Well, is it, when the way that we got there is by cutting all these social services that, children and families and, seniors rely on? I don't think so. And so it is not enough to just rely on some of our state legislators to be carrying the torch on this and speaking out. Whoever is a member of Congress out of this seat has a larger platform, has more influence, has more juice, and so needs to be that person that is speaking up on all things that are happening. Because you are not just our representative in D.C., we need that person to be party leader. It's the only safe Democratic seat in our congressional delegation. We do not have the benefit of being Illinois or California or New York and having all these Democratic members. Then beyond kind of the party building, party leadership side, I think about it as we have so many rich assets in the community, people doing important, impactful work across all areas of civic and public life. What I don't always see, though, at least at the level that I've seen in other cities that I've worked with, is the connectivity across it all. And so I've always believed that that is a role that elected leadership can and should play, and we're just not doing it in ways or at the level that we need to right now. And then the other thing is, I talk to people every single day, and it's just abundantly clear. Nobody gives a damn where a solution comes from. They just want to see solutions to the problems that they're facing in their daily life. They don't care whether it comes from the federal government, a state agency, the city. And so how do we break down silos between federal, state, and local government? I'm not naive. I know it's vision building is not easy, and it's even harder to rally people around a vision, even harder to execute around a vision. But unless you actually have a vision, then you're just walking aimlessly. And I just feel like we've been walking aimlessly for far too long. So bucket number 3, the fix what's broken piece, it's kind of bigger than district. It's bigger than the state party. And I see it as more of this point in time of where we are as a country and as a national party at large, kind of lost in the wilderness trying to find our way. And I don't think the real divide in the party right now is between progressive versus moderate or young versus old. I think a lot of that is language that we're used to, or maybe now we're seeing it as like populism versus abundance, which is progressive versus moderate by another name in some ways of how it's coming down. I think the fundamental split is between those like Congressman Carson that believe that our systems and institutions largely work for people and that we simply need to protect them and manage this period of decline, versus those like myself, in my generation and younger generations that grew up in crisis, or even those that didn't grow up in crisis, and that say, well, yeah, it goes without saying that we need to protect what we have as best as we can, but we also have to recognize that we don't have a lot of actual power right now. And Trump is actively dismantling government day in and day out. And so whenever Democrats come back into power, this chaos is going to bring about an opportunity to rebuild. So I think the question then becomes, do we rebuild back to what we knew, which was not sufficiently meeting and serving the needs of people, or are we going to have the imagination to think about what can be? And personally, I just don't think that the leaders that got us into this mess are the ones to get us out of it. And this whole left center within the party or left right, generally within our politics, construct and binary, it is fake. I mean, there's no reason we have to stick to it, right? If we're going to have a binary, I'd rather it be up or down. I don't care whether a solution is up to the left, up to the center, up to the right. Are we making progress and meeting people's needs for the issues that they're seeing in their daily life? I think the reality is that when Republicans are in office, we're often moving down. When Democrats are in office, sometimes we're moving up, but oftentimes we're stagnant because we're doing the progressive moderate fight and not actually being more about results and about accountability. And so, from the campaign, it's been really fascinating from a coalition standpoint. I've got everybody from Dem socialists to Republicans, not just recovered Republicans, but even active Republicans today, that and everything in between that are coming into the fold. And obviously some are animated by some of these different buckets, and some are animated by others. But universally within the group of folks that are coming together, what I'm seeing is that everybody feels like they are more complex than what any one label can denote. And I think that's something that's important to tap into, because so many people on both sides of the aisle, even good active Democrats like myself, are just tired of the bullshit. I just want to see things work. I want systems to work. I want problems to be solved. Like, it's all it really comes down to at the end of the day. And you don't have to overcomplicate it. So that was a lot of cruelty, but
No,
hopefully.
no, it's okay. I know you had like a little spiel to go through, so I wanted to let you do that. So you kind of said that, there's been this big swing. Do you of Indy being this great city for voter turnout to really pitiful turnout sometimes, like 20%? Sorry, my dog is barking. Rocco, it's fine. Um, so do you think it's because of the gerrymandering, or what do you think caused that?
I mean, I don't think it's any one issue, right? I think that's certainly part of it. I think part of it is we don't have competitive races here in Indianapolis. Congressman Carson's never had a competitive primary challenge except for, the special election that he won to succeed his grandmother. Our mayoral races have not particularly been competitive, from a primary perspective either. If you look at I think also it's just like maintenance of the party, quite frankly. And so Congressman Carson raises about $850,000, on average for a 2-year cycle, which is in the bottom 10% of House Democrats. It's less than half of the average member of Congress. So one of the things that I think about is if he raised even what the average member of Congress did, is he able to, use some of those funds to help out colleagues nationally that are in more competitive races? Does that make him a bigger player in DC? Does that have a downstream political, a downstream benefit of bringing more federal funds home? And or is he able to use some of those funds to, help, build a strong party here? So there's that. Mayor Hogsett has no problem raising money, but his focus is very much just on himself. And so the way that I've always thought about it is Congressman Carson has power and influence that he doesn't wield, and Mayor Hogsett has power and influence that he wields only for himself. And we need a fighter that's going to, wield it for the people. Yeah.
Okay. So my other question is, you mentioned that like kind of the difference. So is the primary goal of this race? Because I had questions. I'm like, you say he's inefficient. Obviously, it's a House run by Republicans right now. Are there specific situations you would have made different decisions or taken different actions than the congressman, or is it true, or is it just more about looking towards the future and trying to build the Democratic Party?
It's There's certainly the looking towards the future, building the Democratic Party piece, and it's a great question because from a vote perspective, look, I'm not saying that the congressman is not a safe Democratic vote, but the reality is that anybody that gets elected and sits in this seat is already going to be a safe Democratic vote. But it's about what can you do with the role beyond that, right? So part of it, like the legislative leadership standpoint, is actually being a proactive member, of the congressional delegation that's trying to get things done. We're not seeing that. Even if not being a proactive member from a legislative leadership standpoint, like I mentioned, there's being more proactive and bringing, more money home. And I'll come back around to that and give an example. Again, like I said, there's then the party building side of things and using that platform to play that role. There's the party leadership, side that I spoke to, using that platform to play the role. There is the breaking down silos aspect that I spoke to, using that, that influence, that platform to play that role. There is the being the convener, the connector, collaborator, side of things, using that platform to play that role. Right now, none of those roles are being played. It's just coasting, on an aim, on a legacy, on being comfortable. And so, again, this is not about me versus the congressman. This is about, inertia versus urgency, at the end of the day. To give a concrete example on, the grant side, is something. Because this is what I was doing with cities all over the country. And I'm probably going to get a little into the weeds here and maybe lose some people, so I apologize in advance, but just to kind of get a little bit of texture. If I'm elected, I want an actual grant writing operation within my district staff. And, take the infrastructure bill, there are 385 funding programs. Inflation Reduction Act, 185 funding programs. All these other pieces of legislation with their own funding programs. I was tracking all of these things, right, for my clients. We need to be able to know everything that's out there to then bring to the community. Because sometimes it's the city of Indianapolis that's going to be the eligible entity to apply. Sometimes it may be a nonprofit. Sometimes it may be a business. Sometimes it may be a consortium, that needs to be put together. we cannot get at bats, so to speak, if we don't know what's out there. And then once we bring this information to people and then they decide whether they want to go for it, then we can be that central hub and resource to actually do the grant writing. Because the reality is, when most folks apply for federal grants, they have ideas, but not actual concrete projects. Because the way that it operates is that you'll have career staff in whatever specific office within a larger agency that is scoring the applications line by line based off, a very detailed and constructed rubric. And the vast majority of applications don't even meet, the baselines that are necessary. Of those that do, then it is a smaller subset that gets put forward into a recommended or highly recommended memo that goes up to the secretary of any given agency. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, the way most people think about, federal grants is, hey, if an eligible entity knows about it and wants to apply, they apply. And they figure it out, themselves. And once they apply, then, hey, maybe they'll try and get a letter of support from their congressman. And it's like an auto pen signature, and that's kind of it. That's important, but that's one tool in the toolbox. And so the way that I think about it is there are two buckets always from an advocacy standpoint to go for. There's the White House and whatever agency, let's say Department of Transportation, that actually administers funds. Within each bucket, I think about different functions: policy, intergovernmental affairs, which is outreach to state and local officials; legislative affairs, which is obviously members of Congress; public engagement, which is everything external facing that are not elected officials. So whether it be labor or businesses or nonprofits or whatever it might be. And then political, which in agencies is typically intergovernmental affairs and legislative affairs. But there's always a senior advisor to a secretary that kind of carries that political lens. And so, understanding, keeping an ear to the ground to know at what stage in the grant cycle are things right now. How do we schedule our outreach and requests for meetings, and build that cadence so that it's a steady drumbeat of things being well socialized within, an executive branch administration. And then, when it's that 2-3 day window after political appointees and political leadership within an agency give their thoughts based off the memo, and the secretary is then deciding, then picking up the phone and calling that cabinet official or that sub-cabinet official, and at the high impact time to be able to get it done. So it's not enough to just have your staff write a letter of support or have the entity that's applying write a letter of support to then put my name on it, right? It's about quarterbacking an operation and making sure that we're able to bring all the pieces of the puzzle together. And so something is simple, I guess, is that to make a real difference.
Okay. So you kind of are saying you want to be an advocate, a more active, involved politician, kind of working for the people kind of a thing. Is that right?
We need a cheerleader for Indianapolis. We need somebody that it's going to roll up their sleeves and do the work. That understands what the work actually looks like, but beyond just being a face.
Okay. And then I know that it's like a little bit, there's some questions that we've gotten questions. Let's start with that. Do you know why Indiana raised the rate on tobacco, on taxes on tobacco? I know that they said that they're out of money, but we also have a surplus, so people are confused. I don't know if you know anything about it.
I've not been tracking the tobacco issue, unfortunately, so sorry to whoever has that question, but I'm happy to look it up now.
Totally fine. So someone else said, how do you expect Indiana to handle less federal funding? Like, what would be your game plan to kind of, that was one of my questions, is to mitigate some of the things that are in the big, beautiful bill. What legislation or what would you do to counteract some of that?
This part's tough, right? Because cities are going to be most hurt by this, because with less funding, obviously that's less the state and cities, but it just shifts the burden, right? And so mayors all across the state are going to figure out how they're approaching this. And a lot of people are going to be hurt. There's no getting around that. That's just the reality. One of the things, again, I like to think about things from like a systems level. And so, I've got my Fair Shot agenda. It has 5 different kind of policy buckets. and each with kind of a slew of different positions on it, just to kind of put a stake in the ground on what I believe in and what I think is important. And as I go around the community, there are three issues that I'm consistently hearing about: potholes, affordable housing, and homelessness. And on the potholes, piece, for example, when I talk about that, I often hear people say, like, well, that's a state or local issue. Why don't you run into this or that, right? But my response is anything that's a state or local issue can also be a federal issue, right? So again, how do we break down silos? How do we just solve people's solutions, and it doesn't matter where it comes from? So if I, by virtue of being a more proactive congressman, am able to help bring more federal money home for issue X or issue Y, does that free up the city budget here in Indianapolis, that they don't have to put money towards issue X and issue Y, and so they can put money towards our infrastructure, right? That's one example. Or let's look at the federal level at the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Program. That is a federal funding, that is a federal funding formula program, and right here it's around surface transportation, but federal funding formulas are across the board, right? It just means that it is not a competitive grant, and that states are getting a set amount. That set amount is based off of population, not based off need. But Indianapolis is very similar to other cities that I've represented, Democratic cities, often capital cities in Republican states, where the dynamic is the same of Republican leadership wanting to stick it to that Democratic city, and so not flowing a lot of funds that come through the state down to that city. And so why don't we have a caucus of members of Congress that represent other communities that fit that, to then push to rethink what this federal funding formula looks like? Because to do something like that, again, a systems level change, a definitional level change that would not only have a huge impact in our infrastructure, but it would have a huge positive impact downstream on a whole host of different issues. And here's the thing: Republicans, I may not like what they're doing right now, but they think outside of the box, that's for sure. And they show just how fragile these systems are, and these are social contracts that we abide by until somebody doesn't. So why are we playing by a different set of rules? And so this is what I mean when I say, do we rebuild systems back to what they were, which weren't sufficiently serving and meeting the needs of people? Or are we going to have the imagination to think about what they can do? And so anybody who hears that and tries to dismiss it and say, oh, well, that's not possible, this is a thing, this is a statute, who cares? The other side doesn't. Why aren't we trying to do more of these things, right? And do it in ways that actually serve people? That's a thought.
Yeah, no, I've always said I think that the Democrats need to hire a marketing team or something. I think that would be very helpful.
For real.
Yeah, for real. Okay, so let's talk about some of your positions. What is your views on business, specifically big business, and things like corporation taxes?
Look, I mean, that's some of what we saw, here on the state side, right? Where, we're giving, corporate, corporate tax cuts, and we're doing that off the backs of Hoosiers, seniors, off of families, off of, children. And so that's just wrong. A budget is a moral document, right? And where we put our resources tell us what kind of society that we are and who we care about. I'm the only candidate in this race that doesn't take, corporate PAC money. 98.3% of my money comes from actual individuals. The 1.7% comes from a couple of friends that are in elected office, and so they gave out of their campaign committees. So closer to 100% basically. Whereas 78% of Congressman Carson's money comes from PACs. This is his best fundraising quarter ever, but also his highest on PAC dependency. So the reality is he is borrowing from future quarters and trying to raise, earlier now because he has a competitive fight on his hands. 79% of my donations are small dollar donations compared to 7% for him. I've got 5 times more donors in district. I've got 5 times more donors in state. I've got 4 times more donors overall. I've got 2.5 times more money raised from actual people. 0% from corporate PACs, whereas he has quite a bit from corporate PACs, right? So, this gives a sense of who's fighting for who and who's actually the grassroots candidate, right? But the other thing is, yes, I say that I'm not taking corporate PAC money, but I also want to be clear that I'm not out here railing against corporations. Corporations, employ people. Corporations oftentimes do, important work. And so it is not to, do an us versus them sort of thing, right? I am somebody that I think we need to talk about things more from a perspective of raising the floor as opposed to lowering the ceiling. I don't think that we get anywhere by fighting for fighting's sake. I think we need to do so with clarity. I think we need to do so with conviction. And we need to make sure that we're taking care of actual people first and foremost at the end of the day.
So I'm hearing you say that you are more for conscious capitalism than what the traditional form of capitalism that we're currently doing.
I've heard some people reference that term before. I'm not
familiar. It's okay.
What defines it or anything, but conceptually it sounds.
Yeah, basically what it is basically it's just the idea that big corporations pay their fair share of taxes, and then they also do things to make communities better. They're not just there to make money. Yeah. So that is basically the basics of conscious capitalism. But that's kind of what it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, look, the way that I think about it, to me, the single biggest, most shameful policy failure in this country is poverty. It is not unique to Indianapolis, but the fact that 1 in 4 kids in Indy lives in poverty is crazy, and it's unacceptable. And that's based off metrics developed 60 years ago by a labor economist at the Department of Labor that have not been updated since. And, food was, 1/3 of the household's expenses back then. Now it's 1/8. And so the United Way of Central Indiana actually have their own metric system that they call ALICE, Asset Living Income Compensated and Employed. And so, based off that, 40% of households here in Marion County are either ALICE households or poverty households. In some neighborhoods, it's as high as, I think, 77, nearing 80%. Again, unacceptable. To me, poverty is not a singular issue so much as it is a lens and a framework by which to view everything else, right? From economic development and job creation to housing and urban development to, health and, educational outcomes and disparities. And I think that we just need to be really, thoughtful and intentional about seeing the interrelatedness of things. And it also makes me think about, we have a hell of a problem with language in the Democratic Party and how we use it. Look, politics is sport with consequence at the end of the day. Unless you win, you can't govern. And you win by building a bigger coalition. So it's the politics of addition, not subtraction. And so let's take my sustainable future, policy bucket. If I were to lead with environmental health, environmental benefits, if I said the phrase environmental justice, right, that's going to ring alarm bells for some people and have them, close their eyes, shut their ears, and, go crazy. Even though I believe in all that, right? But if I lead with lowering household costs, if I lead with clean energy jobs, then do I get more people paying attention to then where they can then hear everything else that I'm talking about? Well, let's take my stronger foundation bucket, which is kind of like a catch-all of issues from a social safety net perspective. I wish the moral argument was sufficient. We are our brother's keeper, or if you want to get philosophical, John Rawls and the veil of ignorance, what sort of society would you, create if you didn't know what your standing in it was going to be? But clearly it's not. So how do we talk to people about issues that they don't think affect them and help them see their self-interest in it? So if you're a business owner and you care about a skilled workforce, then make it make sense where we're one of a couple of states that don't have statewide pre-K. Well, what are we doing to make sure that children in Indiana are getting the education, the skills, the training they need to enter that skilled workforce, but not just enter the skilled workforce, but enter it here in Indiana instead of leaving, and the continued issue of brain drain that we have. So then you can tie that to social policies that are then making people, right? So all these things are connected. or we want to look at crime and public safety. There are certainly people that are just bad people, and regardless of their circumstances, will do bad things. But you can't tell me most crime is not crime of desperation. So again, what are we doing on the front end to help enable people to live a life of dignity and success, whatever that may look like for them, knowing that it's not a cookie cutter, one size fits all, sort of thing. So that's a little bit I think about all that.
I think that raising the floor makes a lot of sense. When you start looking at other countries, such as even Australia, they had a lot of gun violence until they introduced universal health care, and then suddenly it dropped drastically because their poverty dropped drastically.
Yeah.
And then also they had a mass shooting, and they banned all weapons after that. But it was like right in succession of each other, and I think that's an important thing to look at when we're looking at what raises the floor. Some questions that came in is that do you believe in regulations for business?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then is there a certain level of taxes that you think corporations should be taxed at?
That's a great question. I'd love to get deeper in the data of knowing kind of all the consequences and this and that and things like that. So wouldn't put a specific number at this moment.
Okay, that's totally fine. Do you believe in paid paternity and maternity leave for everyone? And how long do you think that should be if you do?
Absolutely. That's a part of key part of the platform, and a lot of the work that I've done in my career has been, and that I've cared about, has been kind of in the early childhood development space, and knowing that is incredibly important to that. And actually, my first the first internship way back in the day was with the anti-poverty policy team at this think tank, Center for American Progress, and I'm still very close with my old supervisor from there, who's one of the nation's foremost experts on these sorts of issues. So always enjoy the discussions with her on that.
Yeah. And then someone just says they're concerned about businesses dumping chemicals into our streams, lakes, water, and oxygen levels. What do we do about all of this?
Yeah, I mean that's unacceptable. I mean, we have to worry about making sure that we have clean water and clean air. That's like a baseline. Like how do we live? And I mean, I was hearing from somebody that's over in the Mars Hill neighborhood where that's an issue, and so they have those concerns, and so it's something that we need to. And I saw something, I don't know if you saw this a week or so ago, showing that Indianapolis had some of the worst air quality like in the whole country,
yes.
Even the world. So no, these are.
Indiana is sorely lacking on our environmental policies, and it shows. And they just came out also with CNBC just released their best. Oh, he went away. Oh, there you are. Okay, I was like, oh no.
I was getting a bunch of text.
Oh, you're okay. So that they were looking at what best states for best business to like come do business, and one of the things they added was quality of life. And Indiana is in the bottom 5. We're like 3rd worst for quality of life in the nation.
Yeah, I mean it's frustrating, right? I mean, this is the community I grew up in. It's a community that I love, and knowing what its reputation is outside, elsewhere across the country. I think we're in an incredibly underrated city. I think there are so many incredible people, like I mentioned, doing incredible work. And we need a better cheerleader for it, not just to talk about all the good that there already is, but then how do we make it better? How do we become, don't get me wrong, I love the Colts, I love the Fever, I love the Pacers, 8500's, great as well. But like, we are more than just a sports city, and how can we be seen as, one of the best cities to be educated, one of the best cities to raise a family, how do we become, we have a growing tech scene, but we're not necessarily seen as the Silicon Prairie. How do we become that, right? There's an organization kind of in the arts ecosystem called Pattern here, locally, that's trying to do work to, from all these different things, state tax incentives, etc., to make us a better place for the arts. Knowing that that's something that, again, from a quality of life perspective, is important to the community. Right, all the texture that goes on besides just simply having a job and going home. Right.
No, that makes sense. And when you bring up arts, my background, I did vocal performance before I became a speech therapist. So I am very much into arts, and I am very aware of how much art programs are going away in Indiana. Even where I went to DePaul, they got rid of their school of music and made it a creative school because there's just not as many people going into the arts.
Mm.
And, I think that we lose a lot of our own culture and learning and there's so many different ways of learning through art that I think that it's a disservice to children to not have it available.
Yeah.
I also think that it's a big thing that, children, they need support. They need support here so bad. And I don't understand why we can't just put money into things like early intervention, because every dollar you put in early intervention, you get $4 to $9 back from taxes, because that child is going to be a better citizen. They're going to be more successful. We know this. We've known this for a long time, yet we still have to go to the state house and fight for our federal funding and our state funding.
Yeah. I mean, and I love that you threw out that stat because that's one that I always talk about. And I think talking in frames like that is also important to bring more people into the fold, because oftentimes you hear folks talking about, well, we don't need to put money towards that. That's too expensive. And, they want the economic lens, right? All right, well, I'll take your economic argument and let me raise you this and tell you that this actually saves us money on the back end, and it's an investment in our future.
Well, it does, and we need less services. I'm a speech therapist by trade, and I do early intervention. So I see these kids every day firsthand, and I'm like, they need this. This helps them. This helps them succeed in life.
Yeah.
This is such a vital part of lifting up our community that I just want to make sure that you had that statistic.
Absolutely. I was meeting yesterday actually with the CEO of the local branch of a national nonprofit organization, and they've got a whole bunch of different programs, but one such program is that they use funding to have looking at the infant mortality rate in Indiana, right? Just across the board, but then also Black infant mortality. And, they have a program where they'll have a nurse throughout pregnancy, and then up until a child is 2, have, whatever regular cadence of, visits and calls and check-ins, to make sure that everything that's supposed to be done, vitamins, all the different things that, I don't personally know, need to be done, and how that has decreased the rates. But then they also have data showing, I get the exact number, but that every dollar spent, I think it's like $20 or something on the back end that's saved, right?
That's incredible.
Yeah, thinking about these sorts of interventions that are important. Because I'd much rather solve for something on the front end than have to look at it when it's an issue on the back end. I mean, one example, around July, on the evening of July 4th, right, we had these tragic shootings downtown, 7 teenagers involved, 2 were killed. And, the city's response is talking about curfews, which they don't have the ability to, from a staffing perspective, to enforce, talking about parental responsibility, talking about more cops. And look, don't get me wrong, all of that is absolutely correct, but it's not sufficient. It's reactive. And so I think about, Baltimore, cities like Baltimore, cities like Birmingham that have had a huge reduction in youth violence in particular. And some of the interventions that they're doing, weekly block parties, in high crime neighborhoods, having rec centers open as late as 11, having, paid summer jobs for, any team that, needs or wants one, right? And these are things that we're doing to degrees here, but, we can always be doing more, but then on top of that, that begs the other question of, hey, all of these things are not available right now to all kids, but we're not seeing this as an issue for all kids, right? And so if children growing up here in the city are not seeing a future worth fighting for, if they're not seeing a city that believes in them, if the best sense of belonging, that they have is in the streets, that's like a deeper issue. That's a systemic issue that we need to address, right? And so again, always trying to, peel the onion back a layer and not just operating at the surface with band-aid issues, but how do we get deeper? And then, of course, that doesn't even include, all the, gun safety measures and gun violence prevention and everything like that, that we certainly need. And so it's important to look at solving issues from a holistic lens, and not just putting a Band-Aid on it and hoping it doesn't happen again.
Okay. Switching gears just a little bit, but what are your views on Palestine? Do you support Palestine? I get a lot of questions about that for all sorts of people.
I mean, no, look, this is, as a general matter in life, I don't see things as black and white. So to flatten this debate to pro-Palestine or to pro-Israel, I think, misses the mark on it. I think all war is tragic. All loss of life is tragic, especially, civilian, life on either Israelis or Palestinians. So, that's my perspective on that. The reality is that, as I'm out in the community, that's not really something I'm hearing much about. I'm hearing about it from online, a small subset of people, which, like, quite frankly, are coming in bad faith and trying to distract from what I'm actually talking about on the campaign trail, because there's this perspective out there that I am running on that issue, and that is the only reason that I'm running against the congressman. Where that's not at all the case, right? Anybody can look at my campaign finance reports and see that I don't have money from outside organizations or anything like that, like we've discussed. And so, I'm just focused on my message framing the issues that I'm hearing about from residents every single day, like infrastructure, like affordable housing, like social services, like homelessness, like better funding our education system, etc. And so I'm trying to close the gap between policy and people's daily lives here.
Okay. And then healthcare, do you believe in universal healthcare? What's your beliefs on that?
Yeah, I mean, as a personal matter, I think that's the solution, right? But I'm also somebody that believes in choice. And so, when it was the 2020 campaign and, Pete Buttigieg was talking about Medicare for all who want it, that's kind of where I am on it. My belief is that people will then see that Medicare for all is the route, and it will eventually turn into that because it's going to be the better choice. But I don't think forcing somebody into anything is necessarily the approach, certainly at the front end for something that's such a transformative change.
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty resisted at first. Views on incarceration levels in this country?
Oh, I mean, we are far too focused on punitive measures as opposed to rehabilitation, right? And so, I have done a lot of work around kind of criminal justice reform, on reentry issues from my time at the U.S. Department of Justice. It's something that I'm particularly passionate about. There's a lot of great work here in the community being done around it from groups like the Black Church Coalition, advocating for appropriate, measures, here in the state, here in the city. That same nonprofit I met with yesterday actually, takes in formerly incarcerated individuals and gives them jobs, and not only gives them jobs, but provides wraparound services, because there are so many barriers if you're coming back into society, right? And then how do we expect people from a recidivism rate perspective to not go back in and turn back to, whatever sort of lives that they were living before they got them, incarcerated, if we have barriers that make it difficult for them to, get their credit up, barriers that make it difficult for them to get housing, stable housing, barriers that make it difficult for them to get a job to begin with. Another organization that's doing incredible work here, is Recycle Force. Recycle Force is an electronics recycling, facility, and they fully hire formerly incarcerated individuals, and they provide all this training, certifications, and they talk a lot about the ABCs: any job, then a better job, and then a career, right? And so, the work that organizations like these are doing is unbelievably important, and we have to look at it from a couple of different lenses, right? Like there's a justice lens on, second chances, if you want to think about things from that way, but there's also the economic lens. Do we want people to come back out and actually contribute to society and be making something of themselves, be, paying taxes, be, a part of the community, engaged in a real way? Or do we just want to make it harder for people that have already, served their time, and put them in difficult positions, and so I'm certainly on the former.
Okay, very good. We are running out of time. We have about 9 minutes. Is there anything that you wanted to bring up that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, I mean, I I am being blocked by the Indiana Democratic Party in a number of ways right now, and it's because I'm kind of shining a light on the chaos and the institutional rot. Before I got into the race, when it was known that I was exploring the race, I had a former party official tell me that if I ran, I was going to get hurt. I was denied entry from a Democratic event that I had an RSVP to, and told you can't come in. The state party, without getting too much into the details, for 2 months provided me incorrect information, incorrect processes, incorrect authority, delayed me, misdirected, etc., to deny me access to the voter file, which is a tool that virtually every Democratic candidate across the country uses. Trying to slow me down from doing voter contact, from getting out into the community, engaging people, bringing more people into the democratic process, into the political party. They then said, oh, you were misinformed. There is no policy around this except that the state chair has sole authority and discretion, which 2 months after. I am then denied, instead of just delayed, officially denied access to this voter file. And the rationale for doing so was invoking a DNC neutrality rule, which that DNC neutrality rule is inapplicable because it only is relevant to DNC officers, not even DNC members at large. And so I know the DNC chair, I know the DNC CEO, I know the DNC vice chair, and I looped the DNC chair into the chain to clarify. I follow up the following week. I end up getting a call from the DNC CEO last week telling me that they informed the state party that that is an inapplicable use of the rule and inappropriate. I asked when. He said once I sent my initial email. So for over 2 weeks now, the party has been sitting on that, has not responded to the DNC, is continuing to deny me access to the voter file without cause, and doing so simply because they technically can, and trying to find any other rationale. Now I still got, the voter file that I needed, but I got it at 6 times the expense, which for a grassroots campaign like mine, it's something that we can't afford not to have, but that eats into the budget. And so how are we going to say we're the party of democracy, when we aren't letting this be a fair fight? Separately, I was threatened with expulsion from the Indiana Latino Democratic Caucus, unless I stepped down from my role as state central committee member on the party board. So all of these things are happening, and it's all this attempt to create an air of smoke and this and that. But why are folks so scared? The way I think about it, a hit dog holler. So clearly I'm threatening the people. This is the only primary challenge in the country in which Hakeem Jeffries is given to the incumbent. This is the only primary challenge in the country that is getting this level of institutional pushback, both locally, and nationally. So, the question I put to folks is why? Why are they so afraid? Because I'm shining a light on everything that's failing. The reality is that the Indiana Democratic Party forgot how to fight for people, and it doesn't know how to win. I love this party. My whole career, it has been working in Democratic politics. I was 10 years old writing in my school journal about the Bush v. Gore debate and talking about Al Gore's lockbox. The first campaign I worked on, I was helping out, licking envelopes, for the mail, for a mayoral campaign. At 14, I went to my first, campaign rally for Howard Dean's presidential campaign. At 18, I voted for Obama in 2008 and volunteered on the campaign. all of the experiences that I referenced from my earliest internships to my most recent jobs, etc. My involvement with the Democratic Party here in the state for all this time. I've given my life to the Democratic Party. And this is how it's responding, because I'm running against an incumbent, because I'm challenging the systems and the leaders that are failing Hoosiers every single day. And I'm not doing it from a place of anger. I'm doing it from a place of, I'm tired of losing. I don't know about everybody else, but I am tired of one-party Republican rule here. And what we're doing is not working. It hasn't been working, and we need to shake it up, and that's what I'm here to do. And I would also just encourage anybody that maybe feels emboldened, interested in the campaign to check out my website at georgehernado.com. You can learn more about kind of the widest race matters of 3 buckets I spoke to earlier. I've got 3 memos that are 15 plus pages each, deeply sourced, fact-based, that go in depth on these buckets. I've got my full policy agenda out on my vision page. I've got kind of the values, system, our community compass, which we call CLIMB, and kind of lays out, how we move forward and how we interact externally and internally as a campaign. For those that may be inspired to donate, like I said, this is a grassroots campaign. Everything matters, even $7 to bring change to the 7th Congressional District. And we need to pay for this van, so one way or another, this voter file. And anybody that may want to volunteer, we've got, whether you're in district or out of district, we've got all sorts of ways for folks to plug in. We already have over 100 volunteers in the funnel, almost 30 interns. We're building, one of the biggest grassroots operations that we probably will have in the state, quite frankly. And I guess the last piece I'd want to, on that note, kind of mention is, I don't see this race as about me. I don't see it as about the congressman. I don't look at it as one race. I don't even look at this as one cycle. It is, how do we build something via this campaign that can have a lasting impact and that can sustain? So the people that are coming into the fold, the volunteers, interns, whatever, these are folks that are learning how to organize online. These are folks that, as we move into this next phase of the campaign, that are going to be learning how to organize in real life. These are folks that are going to be doing, peer-to-peer fundraising and learning that side of things. So that's something that they can take as they work for other candidates. Maybe, they run for, party leadership positions themselves. Maybe they run for office themselves, right? And so this is not about me. This is about, how do we build a Democratic Party that wants to open doors instead of shut them, that wants to bring more people in, that speaks in ways that allow people to feel seen and heard in our politics, and not just frustrated. Because I am with everybody in how disillusioned, it feels right now with everything happening in the city, in the state, in the country. But now is not the time to step away. Now is the time to step up. Because if we step away, that's how things, there's no bottom to this. We have to be the change. Nobody else is coming to save us. So.
Well, thank you so much for coming and talking with me. I really appreciate it. And I will upload this whole interview to YouTube after, and there'll be little clips that I'll put on Instagram and TikTok. So look for those. And if you don't follow George Hernado, he is on Instagram and TikTok. Is that all, or is there others?
I'm on every platform, and it's just my name, George Hernado.
Okay. Yeah. If you'd like to follow him, go check him out, or go check out his website. And again, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you. You as well. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.